It's been a little while since our last election and polling update, and it's time to check in on how Peter Dutton and Anthony Albanese are doing, and how the ALP and the coalition are tracking going into the next election, which feels like it is fast approaching at this point. Now, I've personally been travelling, albeit for work, enabling me to have blissful ignorance about the inexorable gloom that has engulfed the Australian economy and Australian politics. But eventually you have to return to daily life. So here we are, and there is some good news. Anthony Albanese appears to be in freefall, and the ALP might struggle to retain power at the next federal election. And this is coming from the latest news poll. The latest news poll paints a bleak picture for the ALP and a slightly positive one for the coalition. The ALP's primary vote is below that of the coalition and has been falling. Now, this isn't necessarily unusual. After all, the ALP often wins on preferences rather than necessarily the primary vote. But nevertheless, the coalition now leads 38 to 31 in the primary vote. Now, this doesn't add up to 100, so there are preferences that need to be distributed. The Greens, for example, would have preferences that often distribute to the ALP. The Greens themselves have somehow remained steady in the latest news poll, with primary support actually increasing by 1 percentage point, despite showing themselves to be manifestly incompetent and unready for power at all, with the latest shenanigans over the protests. The two-party preferred vote, however, is where it's at, and that is much more important because that tells us how many seats are the two parties, so the coalition and the ALP, likely to get in the House of Representatives. And this shows marked improvements for the coalition and a marked deterioration in the ALP's fortunes. The two-party preferred vote for both parties is now level, and even at 50% each. That means that after preferences are distributed, it might be too close for us to be able to call at this point who will ultimately win. Now, granted, the election is going to be a very long time in the future, and a lot can change between now and then. However, the ALP's decline in two-party preferred voting doesn't bode well for the ultimate election stakes. The ALP now has to work harder to get back to where it was. The ALP can't rest on its laurels and cruise to victory. It actually needs to do something to regain support. And this puts them in a worse position than they were. And this leads me to Anthony Albanese's own personal approval. And Anthony Albanese's own personal approval has worsened. His net satisfaction has declined and now ties with that of Peter Dutton. This is telling because Peter Dutton has never been particularly popular. He always had a rather tepid reaction. Voters never really warmed to him. His consistently low approval ratings haven't really improved that much. However, Anthony Albanese's approval ratings have certainly declined. However, that said, paradoxically, Anthony Albanese still reigns as the preferred Prime Minister, which does appear to be odd because if you've got the same net satisfaction level, or lack thereof, it's not clear how you'd still be the preferred Prime Minister. But nevertheless, it is what it is. This leads me on to some of the reasons for this decline. And there's no one reason for why the ALP has declined. There are multiple factors that are all playing in together that are really contributing to this. So let's go through some of them, and if you think I've missed anything, well, do let me know that in the comments below. Now, the first one to my mind, and the one that's most poignant, is the cost of living crisis we are facing, because almost everyone feels worse off than they were just a couple of years ago. The news poll also polled people in this, and people in the core demographic, so to speak, i.e. the middle age groups, feel worse off than they did a couple of years ago. They feel worse off under Anthony Albanese than they did under Scott Morrison. Now, many voters might blame Anthony Albanese for this, some other voters might not. However, even if just a few voters start to blame Anthony Albanese, whereas before they might have voted for him, that bodes poorly for the ALP. And we can see these cost of living pressures spread throughout the population. Whether it's a homeowner or a landlord or a renter, everyone is suffering. Renters have clearly seen their rents increase. If it's a homeowner in an owner-occupied house, well, at least they have a house, but their mortgage payments have now gone up significantly more, and gone up by much more than the rents have gone up. If it's a landlord, so oftentimes a smaller investor who is trying to save for their retirement so they're not relying on the aged pension, if it's a smaller investor, they're now struggling and being smashed by higher interest rates. After all, interest rates have gone up exponentially, and significantly more than rents have gone up. This means that people are feeling significantly poorer across the income and across the property spectrum. And this again is bad news for Anthony Albanese. He can't just cruise in on one part of the electorate feeling positive toward him. So he really has his work cut out for him if he wants to regain support. And the ALP has failed to really tackle the cost of living crisis. They failed to do anything that is in any way tangible about mitigating interest rate pressures. For example, the ALP is still going out and spending money. They're still engaging in inflationary practices, and the ALP appears to not have the political will to do anything that would help to alleviate the cost of living pressures. Now, granted, there is a limit to what they can do. It is better, for example, for the ALP to not do anything about housing than to intervene. Because if they do anything about housing, it creates sovereign risk and it deters investment, which then deters supply over the medium term. So the ALP really needs to avoid adverse interventions. And oftentimes when the ALP talks about intervening in housing, it would make things worse. For example, the ALP oftentimes talks about removing negative gearing or increasing capital gains tax. However, those will all make things worse, because if you're increasing the costs associated with property by effectively increasing the tax on that property, people aren't going to go out and build those investments. And that's important because if a property developer is building an apartment block, they need both owner-occupiers and investments to sell enough apartments for them to actually be able to make enough money on this. So if those property developers struggling potentially under those proposed policies, the ALP doesn't actually seem to have a clear idea of how to resolve any of these issues. Rather, the ALP seems to just want to keep going on spending ever more money. Now, granted, they did cut some infrastructure projects, but there's still inflationary pressures from many of the roads and other things that are being built, which drives up demand for labor, drives up demand for materials, drives up demand for capital, thereby making everything more expensive, which includes housing construction. So cost of living, broadly speaking, is a major problem. Part of this might also be the net zero issue and the movement toward renewables, and the ALP's stubborn refusal to consider nuclear power, which again, granted, won't be an instant fix, but the more we keep kicking the can down the road, the longer the solution is delayed. So overall, the ALP is struggling because people are struggling. The next issue is the ALP's seeming desire to tie itself to all manner of quote-unquote woke causes. We can see the ALP becoming more and more progressive, so to speak. We saw this with the voice referendum, which was resoundingly defeated. 60% of Australians or so voted against the voice referendum. The electorates that voted in favour were generally supporting the Teals in the election, and those Teals aren't going to the ALP. If anything, the Teals may go back to the coalition, but they are certainly not going to the ALP, and therefore the ALP seemed to only propose a proposal that actually got support amongst people that were never going to vote for it anyway, and that is a big problem. And that is just one example. The ALP appears to have all of those issues permeating throughout its policy platform. And this doesn't really garner that much support amongst the electorate. It might garner support amongst die-hard Labour supporters. It might garner support amongst the Labour caucus. However, it doesn't garner support amongst mainstream voters. The next issue is the trash fire that has been the ALP's handling of the Israel-Hamas war. Now, whichever side of this conflict you stand on, the ALP has really done a bad job addressing it. They've pursued policies, or at least rhetoric, that don't seem to actually please anyone. For example, they appear to have not condemned Hamas as stridently as they should have. Oftentimes in the rhetoric, there's both siderism. The ALP appears to equivocate, and the only times when they condemn Hamas, they also condemn Israel, and condemn Israel for perhaps retaliating against Hamas. But a lot of the calls for a so-called ceasefire appear to amount to treating Israel as a punching bag that can continually get hit by Hamas without actually responding to do anything about the underlying problem. So on the one hand, you've got their lack of ability or lack of willingness to go out and stridently support Israel and condemn Hamas in no uncertain terms without also talking about Israel and blaming Israel. And it looks kind of like victim blaming at this point. However, on the other hand, the ALP's policies and rhetoric don't appear to have garnered support amongst Palestinian supporters, because the ALP is sometimes regarded as a warmonger, so to speak. Some of the protests appear to believe the ALP is going around stoking war and supporting Israel. So both sides of this debate, either pro-Israel or pro-Palestine individuals, seem to think that the ALP is not doing enough. The ALP's rhetoric has pleased no one. And this has fed into a broader narrative of chaos. And it's not just that people are going to vote on Israel and Hamas, rather people are going to vote about their competence level of the government. And if the government appears to be incompetent, appears to be speaking out of both sides of its mouth, that is going to harm it come election time. And therefore, if we add all of this together, we've got an ALP that appears to be out to lunch and appears to not really care about cost of living pressures. You've got an ALP that appears to speak out of both sides of his mouth while pursuing increasingly progressive courses and pleasing no one in the end. The ALP appears to be somewhat out of touch, and that appears to have manifested in the polling that we're seeing, and it appears to be behind why the ALP support has been decreasing. Now, this doesn't mean it's automatic for Peter Dutton to actually win. Peter Dutton has his work cut out for him because he needs to perhaps get some seats from the Teals or get some seats from the ALP, and winning seats that converted to the other party is always going to be challenging. However, his prospects have certainly improved over time, and in large part it appears improved because the ALP appears to be dropping the ball. But in any case, if you've got any thoughts about this, well, do let me know that in the comments below. And otherwise, thanks a lot for tuning in. Don't forget to subscribe, and hopefully I see you next time as well.